Good morning. What I'm going to do today is to read a story, an entire story written by Abby Poyen Whittier, which Matthew published posthumously. He began publishing her stories, a series of maybe 10 of them, in 1849 in the Boston Weekly Museum. She had died in 1841. And this particular one is called Wilderness Refuge. So what I'm going to show you and what I'm going to read for you is something written by one of the authors of A Christmas Carol, well before, by definition, well before A Christmas Carol could have been written, or certainly when it was published. Now I have to give some background information on this. I'm going to have to read from my Kindle because I don't have a physical copy. I have a microfilm copy, a JPEG of this, and I will show a little bit of that. Now, I have mentioned before that Matthew had a very interesting habit of publishing his pieces side by side on the page under different pseudonyms. He would also take another poem by someone else, which he particularly liked and which was particularly relevant to the subject, and he would place it atop his piece, or in this case, Abby's piece, by way of introduction. So this is no exception, and this is not my imagination. I could cite maybe 20 examples of this, where Matthew, who knew the editors of these papers he wrote for personally, would arrange to have something, say a poem, immediately above or sometimes immediately below his own piece, and they would tell you a secret about that piece. So in this case, here we are, the September 22nd, 1849 edition, which you can look up, I think. At any rate, this is called The Keys to Paradise, and here my copy is just too blurred for me to be able to read it, but I may have to put on the screen who the author is. William, looks like Dowd from here. I don't think it is. Anyway, the gist of this poem is that St. Peter's Irish maid has stolen his keys. It's just a, clever ploy as a plot. But she's stolen his keys and she has let everybody in. So you see the gist of it philosophically. All the sinners, everybody has been accepted into heaven, see? And St. Peter keeps pleading for his keys back. So it's clearly relevant to what follows because Matthew takes Abby's story, a wilderness refuge, rather, and he opens it with a quote. Now, this quote is actually from The Water King by Alexander H. Everett, and the earliest I could find this was 1843, which means Abby did not put this quote there. This is a commentary by Matthew. He opened it with this quote. And the quote is, as he quotes it, "Our Father says that what before we told you was not right, for God has grace enough in store to save a water sprite." Now, you can see that it relates exactly to the theme of the poem that he caused to be placed before. What this means is that Abby, who was an esotericist, she was well-versed in the paranormal and what we might call spiritualism and what we would call New Age thought, as well as, I don't like to use that term, New Age, she was well-versed in the paranormal as well as in mysticism. And Matthew fondly would call her a water sprite. Now, there are at least 3 instances of him calling her a water sprite. One of them is in Lady Geraldine's Courtship, which Elizabeth Barrett Browning plagiarized from Matthew in 1844. One of them is in 1852. I may have read this already, has to do with the nymph of Lurleburg, who was a German river sprite. And Matthew sees a painting of a statue that was in the Crystal Palace that makes him think of Abby. And she was a river sprite, and he used to call Abby a river sprite. And then there's another one in 1837 when they wrote a series of anti-slavery abolition letters to the editor of the Dover Inquirer when they were in Dover, New Hampshire, where they signed Kappa, Lambda, and Mu. Well, Kappa or Kappa is a Japanese river sprite. So I think there may be a couple other examples too, but it's pretty clear that that was his nickname for her. So here he is referring to Abby when he says, "For God has grace enough in store to save a water sprite." And what that means is that she was persecuted, which I have evidence for. She was persecuted as a witch, even though she was a more advanced and more sincere Christian than the supposed Christians who were persecuting her. Now I'm going to just simply read Abby's story. I'm not going to make any comments or point out any parallels to A Christmas Carol. I just tell you, this is one of the co-authors of A Christmas Carol. "Lay the logs higher, Jeannette, higher, higher. They'll catch the beam of them as they come over the hills. I and Jeannette light new torches at the windows and sound the old horn once. Open the door now, Jeannette. It will give the house a cheerful look as they come up, and surely we'll not mind the blast ourselves in such a cause," were commands that were continually reiterated in a woodman's cabin one boisterous February night, far in the wilds of Maine. "Mind, Jeannette, spread the table tidily and keep the hearth clean. Boys though they are, it is good to greet their coming home with pleasant sights. I feel that, sightless as I am." If the old woman who issued orders so unceasingly had not been totally blind, she would have seen what the poor serving woman felt from the beginning, that decorate as she might, the aspect of the little dwelling would be dreary. She had given it indeed the most inviting aspect it was capable of receiving. Yet still, within the house and out of it, there was an atmosphere of gloom. Houses, mere human structures as they are, will take to themselves individual features, do what we may to make them alike, and the grand characteristic of this surely was its somberness. It might have owed this in part to the presence of the blind old woman, though her volubility assuredly more than made amends for that. More likely, indeed, it caught its hue from another inmate. Spite of the torches and blazing logs, in one corner of the room the shadows fell heavily, and there in the midst of them, with his face looking towards the wall and head bent down, was the figure of a man, a grim, savage-looking man, with long, shaggy hair that fell about his eyes, and such an indescribably forbidding, joyless look in his whole demeanor, the mysterious gloom might well have been his own. But for the absent ones, it appeared that two boys, the only children of the household, had been sent out early in the day with commissions to a neighboring village. It was now night. The sky that had promised brightly in the morning had darkened into a terrible storm, and certainly the inmates were not without cause for alarm, when now, after the old woman had talked on in her way for an hour or more, and Jeannette had almost ceased to hope, the ears of both were rejoiced by the sound of approaching footsteps, and the next moment a stout boy, the image of the immovable figure in the corner, had burst in and was enjoying the well-fed blaze. "Come to the fire, children," screamed the childish old woman in an ecstasy. "Both of you come. And Herman, darling, come here to me." The boy glanced around, gazed at the door a moment, and then turned his face upon his grandmother with an expression of bewildered surprise. "Herman is close behind me, I suppose, grandmother," he grumbled out in a voice that belied not his appearance at all. "I thought he followed me in." "Herman not here? Not come home?" screamed the old woman, groping with her hands. "Tell me, some of you." Jeannette, too, came forward with inquiries, but the rude boy only remembered that he had started with him, and he supposed had been close behind him the whole distance. Doubtless he would be in the next moment. But the old woman would not be pacified. The poor boy was lost. She was sure he was lost in the midst of the deep snow and the wild storm, and she wrung her hands and paced to and fro like one distracted. Mother, will you never give us peace?" suddenly interrupted the dark figure in the corner, springing up and darting into the storm. There was a long silence, and then the tremulous voice of the old woman again. "Did anyone accost you in the day, Horace?" "No, but yes, a tall, dark man stopped Herman and talked with him a while, but not long, grandmother." The grandmother sighed heavily and sat down again, turning her face towards the door with that expression so peculiar to the blind, of listening attentiveness upon her face, heightened to very painfulness. But where was Herman? At this moment he stood under a shelving rock, quite protected from the storm, and, singular as it was, accompanied by the very stranger Horace had described. His little face was wonderfully sweet and seraph-like, and though in great emotion now, wearing the impress still of hopeful thought. They were speaking very earnestly together. The boy wept much, and the man, who bore the appearance of a wandering missionary, seemed perplexed and undecided how to act. "Yes, my poor boy," he said slowly after a long pause. "As I told you, a word from me might send your fathers to the gallows." Herman only answered by a fresh burst of tears. "And you are growing up under the same roof," the stranger continued, "every day in contact with his evil breath and beneath his evil influence. Leave him. Go with me, child. I can find you a home somewhere." "Leave him," repeated the boy indignantly. "No, indeed, I shall go home to my own father, wicked as he may have been, and love him all the more." Love him? Yes, love him. Is not love more Christ-like than prison houses and gallows trees? "But how will he repay your love, child?" The boy made no reply, but covered his face with his hands and sat deeply absorbed in his strange thoughts. "Ah, I fear he has a harder heart than all the love upon the earth would soften," muttered the man, turning thoughtfully away. "But go home, child, go home. Heaven forbid that I should ever seek to thwart so pure a purpose. By and by I shall meet with you again." Herman was relieved when the man was gone. Now he had liberty to think, and he laid his head between his hands and traced the shadows in his mind until the whole seemed as a passing scene. New, strange, dismal thoughts they were, yet he brooded over them patiently and almost hopefully. Light mingled in among their forms at length, and he seemed looking down into his own mind as upon the shifting scenery of a moving panorama. Brighter visions arose, and a new world had opened to his view. He was among the angels, as it were, and his whole soul was full of light. But hark! Now a cry aroused him. A familiar voice was hallooing his name, and the glimmer of a torch playing before his eyes. The storm had all abated, and the sky above him, blue and clear, was smiling with unnumbered stars. "Father, father," shouted the little fellow, shaking the snow from his rough garment and bounding forward. "It is you, father, it is you." There was no reply, but the child felt himself lifted in strong arms, wrapped carefully round and round, and borne towards home. Chapter 2. There had been warm greetings in the little room, and though it was vacant now, and the remains of the burning logs were covered up with ashes, even now, spite of its wonted gloom, there was almost a smile upon the face of things. Moonlight came in and lay upon the floor like the halo of a blessing, and the homely brightening of the little windows, the very breathing of the night wind, told tales of hope and love. The room was vacant indeed, but not long so, for now an inner door swung softly open, and the features of the little Herman came to view. It was the same bright, hopeful face he had brought home, and the very aspect of the room seemed to catch its radiance. It might have been Herman, or it might have been a spirit, but the figure stole across the room noiselessly as the moonbeams themselves. It paused before another door, the father's door, and seemed to listen. Then the latch was raised, and it glided in. There was moonlight struggling to dissipate the heavy gloom there too, but the new presence aided it like a charm. On it went till it reached the bedside, and then stood mutely gazing down upon the slumbering occupant. A hard, stern face it was, scowling even in repose, but the watcher leaned over it with an expression of the deepest love. Some slight derangement of the bed covering seemed to have required his care, and he folded the blankets about the throat and bent to listen to the strange, unquiet breathing with almost more than motherly solicitude, and his presence surely dissipated shadows there, whatever might have fashioned them, for he had scarcely reached the door again when the dreamer was convulsed with agony and writhed and shrieked out wildly in his sleep. The next moment, however, all was peace. He had been soothed and reassured, though not awakened, and the intruder had crept up to the same pillow and lay there beside him like a pure spirit. But we have dwelt long enough in night scenes. Give us the clear sunshine and the open day. One's very heart is gayer for the daylight. It was morning, and out into the open air came Richard Layton and his little son, verily engaged in talk. "Ah, but my son," one might have heard him say, and really his voice was quite unnatural in its cheerfulness, "a garden would never thrive here in the wilderness." "Oh, I can make it thrive, father." "Well, and what then? The pleasure of a garden, father. Is that not enough?" No reply. It was plain the old mood was on again. "Then you know, father," said the boy very sweetly, "a garden always looks so smiling," and the child took hold of the father's hand. The little hand was thrown violently aside, and an angry frown silenced the boy's tongue. It was not long, however. The pause was broken the next moment by a low, musical voice, as if in soliloquy. "Strange, anyone should have gone out to hunt for me last night." A slight, very slight relaxing of the ugly brows, and some kind of mumbling reply, inaudible. A veritable reply, however, and Herman's courage brightened marvelously. "I could have found the way alone, I'm sure, and as for the wolves—" Back came the cloud again. "Herman, what are you dogging my footsteps in this manner for? Go home. I want none of your talk." But Herman would not speak again. If he only had leave to stay, he would be silent all day long. To trace the everyday relations of the father and his child would be a weary labor, but by slow degrees a kind of sympathy grew up between the two. Neither was at peace without the other, and yet, as though the natural relation were reversed, it was the child who watched over the parent, and the parent who shielded himself within the protection of the child. As though to aid the purpose with its bright associations, as spring advanced, there began springing up close by the enclosures of the morose Mr. Layton the brightest little dwelling ever seen. In contrast to the barrenness of the other clearing, garden grounds appeared about it as if by magic. Clustering vines flew over the roof, and broad shade trees, left uncut, to be sure, on purpose, waving in the wind, bent over the little pile and smiled like so many guardian angels. Young children nestled inside of it, making mirth and music, and there was mother love within it too, and love about and around it, shedding their light abroad and making glad the earth forever. Time flew on. 6 months, a year, 2 years, and still that cottage. Would curiosity never unfold its mysteries? Who was the Annie who dwelt there and wrought such marvels in the garden? Who were the staid woman and the boys? And more than all, why had such merry, lightsome-hearted people come to settle in the wilderness at all? And now these were solved. There was the old vexed question fretting still. Who was the tall, gray man who superintended everything and disappeared so mysteriously, so rarely seen, too? Of even everyday occurrences, there were enough now to keep alive an interest with the blind grandmother, at least, who sat outside the door in the long summer days and questioned Jeannette unceasingly, as, witness many a little scene. "Look there, Jeannette. Who is that singing? There is a breath of old times in the music. I heard it 20 years ago and more." "Annie." "Annie, but where is Richard, Jeannette? He should hear that. Call him, call him. He is close by the garden fence." Oh, and how does he look, Jeannette?" "Angry, but no, more disturbed. There, he has gone into the house with a rush." "Ah, it overcomes him, that's it. 'Tis bygones back again. But look at Herman. Does he remember it?" Herman followed his father. "And Horace?" "Horace looks like one enchanted." "Has he his dog and gun?" "No, neither. 'Tis an old book that has kept him busy since last Sabbath day. Heaven bless that Annie. She makes me forget it's the earth I'm living on." The grandmother's curiosity was ever on the watch, as again, "What is that, Jeannette? Annie's voice here? Who does she talk with?" "She is offering Mr. Layton some flowers." "Well, and Richard?" "He refuses them and looks displeased." "What? And does she turn away?" "No, she presses him to take them still, but he looks very pale, and puts them back. Ah, now he takes them. And speaks not a word, Jeannette? I should catch my son's voice, I think. No, but he seems somehow touched. That's it. There's good in my child yet, evil as they used to count him. Who hears an ill word from his lips now? Another day. What is that you're minding, Jeannette? You don't answer me. Do you hear? What do you see? The tall, dark man I used to see at the cottage yonder with Herman. The tall, dark man? Has he on sailor's clothes? No, he is dressed all in black. And do you see Richard, Jeannette? Yes, he is close by among the cedars watching them. And how does the man look, Jeannette? Stern, but then he has a kind look for Herman, as everybody must have after all. And Herman? Just like a picture of clouds and sunshine, the light forever uppermost. And Richard, my poor son, what look has he? He covers up his face with his hands. Oh, he must be ill. He shakes strangely. A long pause. And what of them now, Jeannette? Do they talk? Constantly, but now the man has risen up, and he is looking into Herman's face. Why, he is laying his hands upon his head. There he has turned away. Now he is gone. The old woman drew a long breath. Poor Richard! Heaven help him in his need. What of him now, Jeannette? Herman is with him, and he seems like himself. Do they talk, Jeannette? Yes, closely. And how do both look? Herman like an angel, though he has been weeping, and his father, oh, his face is strangely softened. It seems to me a little child might lead him. Chapter 3, and the opening quote is, What changes? Oh, what changes? I know not how I came by the quotation, but there it is. Changes indeed. I just lifted my story over a short space of 6 years, and lo, opening my eyes, what do I see? Instead of the morose man's cabin in the new dwelling last introduced alone, behold a mighty village, churches, stores, and workmen's shops. Railroad cars stop there, to be sure, and passengers alight and regale themselves therein. Behold Horace Layton grown to a man's estate, and tending elegantly behind a genteel counter. Herman grows indeed, but with the self-same seraph face, abroad upon the fields and hedges by the open streams, and the grandmother, scarce more broken than of yore, greeting his return with welcomes day by day. A bowed, gray-haired old man had the little time made Mr. Layton. He was less abroad in these bustling city times than formerly, and indoors humble, meek, and gentle as a little child. It was a sunny summer's day, and Horace had strolled out from the store and was walking, no unusual occurrence, he was walking in Annie's garden. Surely he was no more the rude, brutish, surly man his childhood promised than was light like darkness. There was evidence that he owed this to the atmosphere of the cottage, since he had scarce breathed other since its rearing, and Herman, who had deep faith in the spiritual, was so sure of this, he regarded Annie as his redeeming angel. But be that as it might, Annie was in the garden, and of course, too, and Annie's mother, and all were in animated converse, when the loud alarm of the house dog turned every eye in the direction of the street. My uncles, cried Annie, bounding over the slight fence and greeting two strangers, both somewhat nautical in their appearance, with a cordiality that astonished even Horace. What a meeting! How they all talked, and how they all replied! There were rejoicings in every possible variety of speech. These were two long-expected relatives who were to come there from afar at sea for home and friends. Their elder brother, Annie's father, whom Horace had scarcely seen, it appeared had been a seaman with them in times past, which made the tie between them stronger, though for some reason he had forsaken his sailor's life years before and become a traveling preacher. But a blessing on such meetings. The visitors looked at the house and at the garden, into their sister's face, at Annie, and at one another, and rejoiced. But when one, by chance, after a long interval, glanced at Horace, what a change! Both stood as if thunderstruck. A dear friend of ours, flowed out Annie's clear, rejoicing tones in explanation, but the clouds dispersed not at all. A villain, even the blind old neighbor, heard vociferated. He a friend of yours, and call himself Layton? The young man gazed at the strangers in mute amazement, and another torrent of abuse began. But stop, cried one at length, interrupting himself. This is a mere youth, after all. And, as though struck with a new idea, the two drew apart and conferred together for a while, returning with apologies. Mr. Layton must forgive them. They had somehow taken him for someone else. Had he not a father living? Oh, yes, and Horace recovered his confidence at once. A father, and all said he was his exact image. Was he not violent, this father, and easily enraged? No, people said he had been, but was quite changed of late years. What, had he grown sullen? No, oh no, indeed, not sullen, but quiet and serious. Of course, this had not occurred unwitnessed by the cottage dwellers. Herman had darted away the moment the visitors arrived, most likely to seek the sailor preacher, of whose whereabouts he seemed better informed, Jeannette said, than his own household. The father sat in his own chimney nook, unconscious of it all, and the grandmother still sat by the sill and wondered. And do you see Horace and Annie's garden yet, Jeannette? No, he is coming this way with the two men I told you of. Coming this way? And Richard, how does he look, Jeannette? Like one in great grief and alone. What? I heard them pass, and not a word. Had they gone indoors without a word, Jeannette? But mercy upon us, what was that? What was that? Oh, your son has fallen upon the floor. He is in a fit, and the men are helping him. The anxious serving woman rushed indoors. The man had indeed been seized with a kind of spasm upon their entrance, but he was soon recovered, and now he sat still in their midst, with white lips and glazed eyes, gazing from one to another and out at the door like one lost. The strangers had not come to visit him with gentle speech. They were there to accuse him of a terrible crime. And as each laid a hand upon his shoulder and looked down sternly into his face, whispering low words of menace and accusation, he only bowed his head upon his breast in sorrowful acquiescence. How unlike the Richard Layton of old times! He was even composed and gentle, though utterance seemed denied him, and looked with a deep mournfulness at the distressed Horace that touched their hearts. Poor Horace had brought the strangers there as old shipmates of his father, little dreaming the result. He had never dreamed his father was so haunted by a guilty conscience, and now his agony was beyond description. At this moment a shadow darkened the outer door, and behold, the aged woman who for years had been borne to and fro like an infant, stood erect and firm before them. What would you have? She demanded in the strange Sibyl-like tones that brought a pallor upon every face. Blood for blood? God makes his sun to shine upon the evil as upon the good. Would you mark the sin with blood that he would wash away and whiten with his love? The men glanced at one another and were silent, but the son seemed to gather courage from her presence and turned to his accusers, calling them both by name, begging them to unhand him. He did not wish to escape. Would that the retribution might wash away the sin, he murmured in his throat, though God knows my punishment has been terrible as my crime was terrible. The men drew a little apart, and there was a long, long pause, broken finally by the gentle opening of the outer door, and Herman, with his large, loving eyes and peaceful presence, stole up to his father's chair, and laying his arm tenderly across the bowed shoulders, stood there in the group like a minister of peace. And now, for the first time, it was observed that the father seemed himself and looked around self-possessed and calm. The boy was closely followed by the tall gray man so often mentioned, who silently exchanged a greeting with the strangers and took his place beside them. Herman stooped and whispered in his father's ear. Yes, yes, cried the last stranger. Speak out. Talk to us like brothers. Judgment is not ours, and if better thoughts have come to you of late, go in peace. Heaven grant us but the power to aid and strengthen one another. It was fearful to hear the man talk of his crime. It had occurred on shipboard. Enraged by some want of respect in a cabin boy, he had struck him a blow that had destroyed his own happiness for life. He knew the transaction had been known, but with the authority of a stern commander, he had silenced every whisper till the voyage was over. The sole eyewitness was his old tried friend, Thomas Dinsmore, who, he said, glancing at the tall stranger, loathed him from that moment. Then he told of creeping through dark ways and hiding in lonely places to escape arrest, of his mother's blindness and his widowhood, and the holy healing influence of the angel child Herman. And the father looked into his child's face with a kind of awe, and tears, real tears, rolled down his rugged face. God forbid that we should interfere, murmured the missionary emphatically when all was told. I can but feel how far we are from him when I contrast his code of love, pure, endless, all-enduring love, with ours so fraught with enmity and vengeance. Be it so, brother, be it so, exclaimed both strangers in a voice. Better, surely, time for penitence and hope than judgment such as man might give. God has indeed dealt lovingly with the criminal, and love has brought forth blessings. Blessing indeed, said the missionary, and blessed be his name. Jeannette, Jeannette, here broke forth the old woman, haven't I heard the voice of Thomas Dinsmore, the old bosom friend of my son, who used to sit by his fireside all the long winter evenings, and you named him when he came as a minister? Assuredly, answered the missionary, coming close to her. After witnessing that scene, I could follow the sea no longer. I became what you find me, and it was on a professional excursion in the wilds of Maine that I encountered those two boys. My first impulse was to proceed against their father at once, but when I looked upon the young child there, my heart misgave me. I deliberated a while, and then drew him aside and talked with him. Then, undecided still, I followed the 2 miles through the wilderness to gain speech with him again. My plan then was to win his confidence and then place in a better and, as I thought, more innocent home, trusting in the meantime to his father's isolation for security. But the child's reply opened me to a new world, and I left him with a code of morals in my heart holier than I had dreamed of. But the cottage? Questioned one and another. Ah, the cottage is the missionary's home. He longed for quiet and the deep shade. He longed to watch the penitence and regeneration of the criminal, for he had loved him even as a brother, and he longed too to bring his own Annie into everyday companionship, to witness the good work, for something told him it must all go on. And now can he regret his choice? Chapter 4. Jeannette and the grandmother. There, lugging in that childish old woman again. Shall we never be rid of her? Really, what can one do with her talkativeness and the respect one naturally owes to old age? One must report. Well, well, Jeannette, and what is that I hear like the fluttering of wings overhead? It is Herman's doves. They are flapping their wings about as though they shed down peace. Oh, and how is the garden, Jeannette? And is the gloom gone out of the house yet? The garden smiles like a very Eden, and the house is so full of sunshine, it creeps into one's heart unawares. And Richard and Herman and the rest are all in sight, Jeannette? Yes, and Herman and his father sit on the green yonder with the missionary to talk. And Horace and his young bride, Annie, tell me of that, Jeannette. Both close by. Don't you hear Annie's voice singing with the 2 uncles she dotes on so? Why, and there is just such a light in her face, now she stands there, as there was on Herman's that terrible night when his father brought him in from the snow years ago. Let us feel, now we welcome her to our new home, that God has appointed her too, as well as Herman, a good angel of the house. Again, I won't draw the obvious conclusions to A Christmas Carol because part of this is a matter of the heart. Part of it could be dry intellectual study of style, but this isn't primarily a matter of style. This is a matter of spiritual inspiration, and spirituality. This is the real author behind the spirituality of A Christmas Carol. And let me say that those who love Charles Dickens, imagining he was the author of A Christmas Carol, are loving him because of A Christmas Carol. But I really would like for people to get to know Abby Poyen Whittier. If they get to know her and they read her earlier works, this could even have been written afterwards for all I know. This I think was one of her last ones. It's really the most sophisticated, I would say, or one of the most sophisticated. It's really her. If she died at age 24, who knows what she could have done if she'd lived longer. But this is really her most mature work. you can see the depth of her understanding of psychology as well in this. And many people have commented on the deep understanding of psychology in A Christmas Carol. That also came from Abby, not from Charles Dickens, who was just not that deep a guy. What we have here basically is a rock star who got famous playing other people's songs, you know, however he got them, you know, and they assume there's a natural tendency to imagine and assume that the singer originated the things he's singing and feels the things he's singing, you know, but it's not necessarily true. You know, I mean, I do that too. I just automatically assume that this person was the one that wrote the song and is expressing their own feelings. And then I find out, no, they didn't write that. You know, most of the time they paid for it, but occasionally not. You know, well, this is a case where Charles Dickens had no intention of ever acknowledging that anybody else was the real author of A Christmas Carol. But once you get to know the real author, it's obvious. And I think people will come to love Abby once they get to know her. And they'll love her for A Christmas Carol and not Charles Dickens, you know. So that's all. This is long enough. I don't know how long it took, but I want this recorded, you know. And it'll take a little bit of time because I made some stumbles. There's actually a few typos I found in it that I had to read through and so on. I'll have to fix. So where you see either dissolves or possibly I'll put the original type up over it. Those were places where I had to stop and start over and so on. I couldn't read it all the way through. But anyway, I think it's pretty obvious. I don't really think I need to comment on it any further, and I'll go ahead and get this one in the can.